Do you want to start? Because you don't have any slides.
Yes, I think no slides is no guarantee that it'll be faster or shorter. but I'll actually be very fast and short because I wanted to get the conversation on waste off the ground with maybe something positive. I think as long as we talk about waste as waste, we're not going to get nowhere. If we start talking of waste not as waste but as a resource, then I think we're changing the mindset. We're changing the way we're looking at it. We're changing it from something that's negative to something that's positive. My company does not work in technology or anything like that, but we do a lot of facilitation around culture and culture change and change management in general. And a couple of years ago, we've been working with a large chemical concern. There are about 150 plants worldwide. And we facilitated 3 days of meeting of the 150 plant managers around one single question, which was, how can we turn our waste streams, each of those 150 companies, how can we turn our waste streams into resource streams for the other companies into this large chemical consortium? It was very innovative. It was also very interesting because very rapidly it appeared that this conversation cannot be kept inside any company or organization. Yes. One of the conclusions was that it's not about money. Yes. Of course, I pay to get rid of my waste and you pay to get some feedstock. So if I can turn my waste into your feedstock, then we're both winning, right? But the winning is not about the money. Yes. The winning is about the opportunity. The winning is about the open innovation. The winning is about the collaboration between companies. And I thought this was really very refreshing. So let's not talk about waste. Let's talk about the resource that waste represents for our economy.
Perfect. I only have one slide because I have to go to the bathroom, so I'm going to be very brief. That's a perfect setup for me for this one slide, which is showing raw material consumption in the United States in the 20th century. And what isn't plotted here is the relationship of consumption to population. But you can see something happening in one particular industry, which is my industry, our industry, the building industry. We are consuming raw material for the construction industry at just an astronomical scale that does not line up with the increase in population. So the question that, and especially when you're comparing it to other industries. So the question that I want to pose to us is, how do we reduce waste by not consuming it in the first place? Whether it's turning waste product into feedstock or not using less, or you just simply using less feedstock. So that's the question I'm posing here today. I don't know who's up next, and I'll be right back. Ken?
I'm up next. And this is a wonderful graphic from the Cradle to Cradle people. I think one of my most rewarding moments here was year before last when somebody in one of the congresses said, hey, you know what I learned at DOS? I learned about this concept of cradle to cradle, and it was like, oh, that's what we're trying to do. What is so powerful about this, I love this notion of a resource stream, quit calling it waste, but what was so powerful about what Brungart and the chemist, or sorry, the architect and chemist, their name is escaping me at the moment, I should know, McDonough and Brungart, was they created this notion of cradle to cradle, circular economy, and they said that there were 3 parts to it, that we had to separate our industrial society into biological nutrients, water of which is one, poop, another, versus technical nutrients. Now think about what we just said, what Michael just said. All of those resources that came out of the ground are now sitting in the cities. We're going to be mining our cities in the future for these materials again. So deconstructibility in my industry is very important. But the one that really gets me is this notion of the monstrous hybrid, that industry has to be responsible for storing all of the monstrous hybrids, these 5,000 new chemicals that we don't understand, these poisonous materials that can't be recycled into the technical stream or the biological stream. Industry has to be responsible to safely hold those from all life forms, not just human, but things that would damage any living thing on this creature. They have to be responsible for holding that until the technologies are there to return them to the technical or the biological stream. Precisely. Food for thought. Systemic food for thought.
Did Michael take the question? It's one of those things. Okay. I'm assuming I might be next. Yes. Okay. So one of the things that I think is an issue is leadership, and how do you identify leaders, and how do you identify what you want to measure? How do we, and we talked a little bit about it earlier with the water and everything, measuring things, whether it be meters and things like that. One of the things that the UK, and again, I'm kind of in the same thing with construction and facilities and things like that. One of the things that the UK did was they found a leader that stood up and said, we want to do 4 things. We want to reduce cost by 30%. We want to reduce weight, we want to reduce time by 50%. We want to reduce our carbon footprint by 50%. And we want to make the UK construction industry, in using building information modeling, #1 in the world. And if they do the first 3, they'll probably be able to accomplish the 4th, because they'll be able to come into any other country and legitimately win both design and construction contracts to be able to accomplish those other things, because everybody's looking to reduce time and dollars and things like that. So what I'm suggesting in the United States is we also have some metrics that we start working from, and that we find a leader. There is no leader right now in the United States for the construction industry to do things like, reduce that amount of materials that Michael was talking about. And so what's happening is I've identified over 250 organizations, associations, agencies that are all supposedly doing good things, but it's all like Brownian motion, because there's nothing moving things forward. There's nothing measuring that we're making any progress. And I briefed it last year, which just blew me away, because I thought the energy was one of the areas that we were actually doing pretty well with. But of the 5 million commercial facilities in the United States, things like LEED, Green Globes, Energy Star, all those things have affected 0.6%. That's not even statistically relative. So when are we going to get serious about actually doing some of this stuff? We talk about, ways of improving productivity, the ways of lessening the amount of waste. Offsite construction is one of those things that can do that, because now you have an environment that's actually much safer for the worker, that you can set up jigs that will allow you to be able to construct more efficiently. What they're finding is, like, pipe fitters in a situation like this can, instead of doing 200 linear feet a day, can do 600 linear feet a day. And now you also can control the waste stream, because the materials that are being not necessarily being used can be recycled, or in fact reused in the process of offsite construction. The other one that's hit me quite a bit is the impact, and I had the opportunity to do a presentation to the Transportation Research Board in January. This is our interstate system now. It was a system that was conceived about 60 years ago, and we've built just about as many lanes as we can, and we haven't figured out a way to improve on that. There's the Department of Transportation has a study, it's called Beyond Traffic 2045, I think it is. And I read that, and it has a lot of the same scare numbers in that we've talked about some of earlier today. And that doesn't seem to be affecting anybody anymore, as far as how much water we have. And I mean, we have all these issues that we've identified, and it's frightening to think about it. This report is, and it's supposed to be a plan for the future, but this report identifies all the things that are going to come to a screeching halt because as gridlock goes to deadlock. But what are we doing to change anything? And how are we coming up with new plans? We've got Google and Amazon and things like that want to deliver products to you within an hour after you order them. And in the construction industry, 6 months is not too bad. I mean, there's got to be something in between. And the same thing with the facilities industry. You've got things where there's an example, and probably some of you have seen it, where 60 in China, in 15 days they build a 30-story building. Okay, and interestingly enough, if you put the economics to that, you find that that really could have, in 15 days, considering they say the alternative is like 15 months that it usually takes us to build a building, something like that. The difference in that, if that it was a hotel, it was a 330-room hotel in China. If you just rented those rooms out at $100 a night, that would be an extra $15.8 million in that owner's pocket. And I think it's not only leadership, but I think the second thing that's absolutely critical is we look at first cost. We don't look at what is the impact, and that's the other thing that we're working on now is total cost of ownership. What is, over the life of the facility, what is the total cost? Because now what you can do is you can see what is the impact of not doing some of these things. And that's, I mean, all the things we've been talking about, whether it be water, waste, and energy, and all the other things, what's the cost of not making these changes? And we're just not oriented towards that right now. We're oriented towards first cost. And I think until we look at that bigger picture, we can't solve any of these. And we talk about things like sustainability, but we don't have total cost of ownership in place, so we don't have any metrics in order to be able to assume how to improve and measure change and measure improvement.
Thanks, Deke. My name is Frank Sarno. I'm with Mortensen Construction. I love that slide that Michael showed, showing how much resources the construction industry uses. And the reason why I love that slide is because there really is when you start talking about waste in this industry, there really is a correlation between how much resources we use and what we're trying to do to kind of curtail some of that. First question for the audience. How many times do you think you need to be asked to present here at the DAS before you say yes? Does anybody have an answer to that? 3 times I said no. So I want to thank Michael's persistent for me to come up here and talk. So I thought that was great that I was able to actually come up here and talk with you guys. The idea of some of these big systems, these connected systems, is sometimes overwhelming to someone like myself, a former project manager. So I wanted to try and break down this conversation into some very applicable things, but things that are realistically very far out into the future in terms of getting uniform adoption in an industry as stagnant or as static as the construction industry. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was the idea of eliminating this idea of a waste. How do we eliminate the waste from the stream? And Deke kind of hit on this idea of prefabrication. And so what we're trying to do at Mortensen is trying to figure out how can we model it better in a 3D environment and then actually produce it in an off-site facility, which is safer, and then be able to control that waste stream as it goes from the plant, this facility floor, to the construction job site. What we see out in construction, as we say with use of resources, is over like 40% of that it ends up being in waste if you don't model it correctly and you just bring out raw material to the job site. And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to figure out how we can do that better. Prefabrication seems to be one way where we can build it safer and we can actually reduce that waste stream. Now, one of the reasons that this is important to me is I work for a group called Project Solutions within Mortenson, and we have a very small slogan of let's change the industry. Let's try and figure out how to do that. Now, we're doing that from one construction company, and there's probably a handful of construction companies around the United States that kind of thinks the same way that we do. But that's, again, handful compared to the thousands that are out there working every day. So how do we get this type of thinking embedded into our trade partners, our design partners, all the way down to, you know, the common craft worker out there in the field? So this is one way that we think that we can do that. Another way that we, again, from a very long-term perspective, is augmented reality. Now, I know that, you know, the software conference, technology conference, we want to talk about kind of the new features out there in technology. But where I think this works is down at the craft level. If there's ways, and we're working on ways to do this, bringing augmented reality to the person at the point of work, if they can see that in this connected environment, they can see the context that this work that they're doing is actually in the wrong location. We can eliminate the rework that plagues our industry right now. As fast as we move as a community with our design partners and our customers, these decisions that happen that change the work that we do is, one, demoralizing. There's nothing more demoralizing than ripping out work. So if we can, at the speed of these decisions that are coming in, if we can get that down to the worker in the field so that they can see from an augmented reality perspective that what they're putting in is correct and that it's not going to get ripped out. If we could do that, we have the opportunity to kind of change that waste stream within construction.
I want to go back to your previous slide and
Yes, sir.
maybe tie a couple of things together. Prefabrication inherently reduces raw material consumption. So, and I'm not sure I'm using your image correctly or not, but
Sure.
if you're assembling wall systems on a construction site, or think of any finished material like tile or carpeting, the contractor calculates how much material is needed, volume, whatever the units happen to be in square footage, and then has to add a certain percentage or contingency because the units don't line up with the volume, right? So, so more material has to get shipped to the job site than is really needed. So, for example, with tile, that contingency is probably somewhere between 10 and 20%. What happens to that 10 and 20% of raw material that doesn't get installed? Yes, landfill. Very little of it makes its way back. Drywall, there's a huge amount of that type of waste. So when you're working in a factory environment, you have an inventory that you're pulling off the shelf, right? And you're able to optimize the cutting of the units so that you're wasting as little as possible. So even before you get to the point where you're cutting down on waste, you're cutting down on consumption before you even start.
And time is the other big piece that goes into this, because now you're starting to assemble in parallel instead of doing everything sequentially.
And Deke was talking about the total cost of ownership. So for a typical commercial office building, does anyone know what percentage design and construction represents of the total cost of ownership for the life of that facility? It's 25. But yes, so 75% of the total cost of ownership is the operational cost of that building for its useful life. For a complex facility like a hospital, a pharmaceutical lab, biomedical facility, it's 90-10. Design and construction represents 10% of the cost, of the life cycle cost of a hospital. If you reduce the operational cost of a complex facility by 11%, you pay for the building. So those are the metrics that spurred me to start a company 4 years ago to help owners reduce the operational cost of their facilities.
We don't have the numbers for this one too, though. But we're starting to try and track it. When you get facilities management in play up front. The people that are going to run the facility, if we can talk to them during construction, way at the beginning, because you just think of how much rework we do after we built this whole building and someone comes in and says, I need this here and I need that, and then they start moving things around. We're starting to try and track that. It's a tough metric to try and track, but that's another thing where if we get the stakeholders and we can talk to them early, it just makes for a better building long term.
I would have been happy to pay you to say that because we won't take an engagement with an owner unless the ultimate consumer of the information is at the table at the beginning of the project. Because the project will fail. And I'll pass the microphone on.
We got one over here while you're moving it along.
I'm just curious, to the extent that your mission, which is, as you observed, sort of a lofty one, is to change the industry, the industry's economics might make that challenging, right? So you mark up the materials. If you buy an extra 20% of the materials and throw them away, you're getting the markup on 20% additional materials. You mark up the labor. What's the real incentive to being more efficient? So how do you provide incentives for an industry to create these efficiencies at the outset? Because that's what will drive the change.
Yeah, I think your point is very good. Depending on the contract type, will depend on that for sure. If you're getting paid by material, like the old way that people used to, get paid when they would paint the barn, I'll pay you by the amount of buckets you've got, and that's what I'm going to pay you by. We try to avoid those kinds of scenarios as much because it does create incentives that are just wrong for the customer. But the industry's ripe for that, and so that's basically one of the reasons why when I was talking about what did I want to speak on, where we're going to talk about lofty goals, lofty missions, and what I wanted to talk about was just one little slice is how from the aspect of, let's say 25 contractors and 25 designers have this mission of they really want to do things better. And the rest of the industry is not ripe for that. They are still trying to figure that out. We have to, what we feel like is if we can lead the way through communication and then get things correct and just kind of start showing that we can hopefully start migrating that down through the different layers of the different size companies with different missions. So you're right. How do we get down to the we'll call it the smaller contractor that's just trying to eke by and trying to get, I need an extra 3% or they're going to go out of business because, and that person has this incentive to try and figure out how to get paid differently.
The change order is sort of the lifeblood of the construction industry. That's where all the margin is, right? So if you eliminate the rework, you eliminate the change order. Right? And that's where everybody's making their money.
I would like to think, and again, you're right. Again, this is a different. It's a problem, and it's more than just a perception problem in the industry of the people that we work with. I would like to think that we can do that better. That we can still make good margins, if we can do it better from the beginning. Work hand in hand with a designer, in order to get it so that we don't have those change orders in the end.
I think you're correct that much of the business model that construction is based on is profit on waste. But the business model is changing, and there are competitors like Mortenson who are producing buildings at a lower cost and still maintaining their profits. And the market is going to take care of the people who want to stick to the old paradigm. It's going to take time, but the shift is happening. There's no question about it. Jack.
Regarding the scrap, 20% scrap, why isn't there an arrangement to turn that into resource, like working with Habitat for Humanity to pick it up and go use it to build something for other people?
That's a good question. And having worked for a large construction company for 5 years, I'll tell you that the answer is it costs too much to do that. It's cheaper to throw it away. It's cheaper for the construction company to throw it away. That's the problem.
They don't have to throw it away. I'll pick it up.
So the have to,
Logistics of that,
Yeah.
I've been there.
so they don't have to throw it away, Jack. That goes back to what Kristen F. opened the conversation with is I control the waste stream and that's valuable to me. There's two back-to-back ideas. One is the idea of the first in class. When you do this is just what I love about what you're doing. Because when you run the 4-minute mile, everybody knows it can now be done.
That's right.
And everybody's scrapping and scraping and living off change orders sees a better way. And that's where we were talking about leadership, and I'll submit to everybody here that we see an industry leader right here. Because you're going after, so I've been working to try and understand in terms of mining the waste stream at NASA, we have such just incredible knowledge that is just swept away, and then we lock in on one thing like James Webb, right? The James Webb Telescope it's beautiful, it's fantastic, and it's huge amount of investment in one thing, right? And what about all the other things, right? And so this first-in-class mission is how we've been phrasing it, and then go to National Geographic, something a little bit less sci-fi, right? Is there's a great thing out there you can just Google wildebeest and zebra, and when wildebeest try and cross a river, they all cross. Some of them make it, most of them make it, and they eventually find a vulnerability in the bank. And when one of them makes it up, the entire crowd goes up, and that's what that first-in-class does. There's a zebra strategy as well, where they stay clear of the wildebeest for obvious reasons, and they route and swim across on their own. But they have a vulnerability that they will disappear in mass. And so, like if they make the wrong decision crossing the river, they get swept away and they're gone. And so it's more effective, but it's more vulnerable. And so you're kind of in the wildebeest territory, whereas when you make that first in class and you can level it, it channels the whole crossing right through that, and eventually there's a flipping bridge there. But
So a milestone that's perceived as being insurmountable, once it's surmounted, suddenly becomes the baseline.
oh, 4 minutes? Well, can anybody do 3.8? Like,
We see that in athletics all the time, right? And it's the same thing with this type of innovation.
So I had one question. Are you familiar with Blue Homes at all? BLU? So about 5 years ago, I attended a conference where they were presenting. They did 100% prefabrication of homes, and their biggest challenge was actually transporting them from their factory to the job site. So they engineered a really interesting way of folding the home up in order to be able to get it there. And 3 months ago, they closed their doors. And they reduced their waste stream by over 90%. They were selling homes they looked like a traditional, stick home that somebody built on the job site. They did colonials, they did multi-story, full basement. Everything was done in the factory. It was completely finished in the factory, and they closed their doors 3 months ago. So I thought they had the right idea. They were doing really, really well. They did exactly what we're trying to do here and eliminated their waste. And the market just dried up. They just didn't get it.
Do you know the why of that? Because the housing
Well,
industry
I'm
is-
trying to find it
yeah.
out. I literally heard about it last week, so I'm trying to find out what happened to them.
Interestingly, there's a negative stigma on prefabricated bathrooms because people think you can't get them as nice as you would if you built it in place. So sometimes we don't talk about prefabricated bathrooms, but we just may do it anyway because of that stigma of the prefabrication. I'd be willing to bet somewhere in there is a perception of what's a prefabricated, it's a manufactured home versus the quality was probably there. And there's probably some perception to it.
Probably better quality, actually.
Yeah.
There's a couple of points that I want to make. Being a little architectural and engineering firm out of Los Angeles, we have a pretty big impact. But what I'm starting to see when it comes from the business side is how are we starting to reshape ourselves, all right, into an entirely different model from what's today. Because what is happening today, like you said, incentivize, the change orders are the real cash flow and those kinds of things. So, with our company, we've started to merge, some of these activities to where it becomes one-stop shopping, right? So the first point is the contingency that has to be taken out by some of these guys can get up to 20, sometimes 40%, right? On if a developer wants to do a building or a facility, he's got to take out 40% more, and that's the interest rate on that per day is a lot of money, right? So I think the incentivization comes from some of the larger players within the industry. A phenomenon has been happening at AECOM that when we decide to implement a piece of technology, we're seeing 2,000 and 3,000 subs getting affected by just that one simple decision that we made. So it helps drive a lot of the industry, what he was saying about what you're doing at Mortenson. Because what you're doing, you're driving others. So I think in the industry, you know, you've got like your top 10, right? And I think if they all start, you know, getting together and innovating on their processes, I think you'll see a lot of industry change, because we're starting to see it now.
Can I be devil's advocate for a second? Sorry, I'm an architect. But Jack said something when we were having these conversations that just got me thinking, and talking about waste. All right, so we're into the AEC industry. That's cool. Jack had mentioned the waste of the human minds that are on this planet because they haven't been properly educated. And that is truly a great crying shame. When I traveled to India in 2007, I was surprised to see all the people that were working on the roads. And my host told me that in India, and please tell me if I'm wrong about this, that conscious decisions were made not to deploy automation so that people had work. And 2 years ago, I had this wonderful opportunity to go to Spain. Now, what I was experiencing in Spain was the tourist view of Spain, okay? But to realize I was in a world made by hand, craftsmanship. What is that worth? And if we're going to be a long-lived society on this planet and adopt a planetary perspective, I think that future generations will benefit greatly from beautiful hand craftsmanship. And so I would advocate for ways of integrating that in and thinking about automation in those longer terms, because we're all wrapped up right now and going 100 miles an hour. But, you know, there's a lot to be said for going slow. Okay. Did I provoke any thoughts there? I did get one. I'll get the mic back to you. Doc?
I think there's a role for craftsmanship, but comment and a question. Japanese company, Sekisui Housing, all prefab. And one of the secrets is that they spend as many labor hours on design, working with the customer, as they do putting the house up. Once you have committed, that's what it's going to be. No changes. And so that's a smart way to do it. Next question. Mostly we're talking about construction of buildings. How come we needed the building to start with? Do we ever talk to the customer about that?
Hey, we need design fees.
Doc, it's interesting. I came here from another conference in San Diego called the BIM Forum, which stands for Building Information Modeling. And the theme was, what do owners want? Meaning institutional building owners. And someone representing the healthcare industry said that hospitals are the single largest piece of medical equipment. And without the building, there is no healthcare. So it's kind of, you know, the opposite side of the coin. But I think the question you're raising is, before we build, we should ask the question, why, and do we need it? And it's a question that's not asked enough.
Well, and can we repurpose things that are already out there, I think is along those lines. Yeah.
And right. And coming back to where Chris started, this building is a mine of raw material. And at some point in its life, this building will be completely renovated or demolished. That's a fact. We know that. What's going to happen to this?
Landfill.
And the carpeting in this building, if its composition was known, the carpet industry is very, very good at recycling material, but the composition has to be known. Is this nylon? Does it have a rubber backing? And what happens when it comes time to recycle this building is that we don't know enough about its contents, and forensically collecting that information is so costly that it's easier to just tear it down. And we, quote unquote, recycle, but we're doing that in a very crude way. If we knew precisely the contents of this building, the owner could issue RFPs for reclamation, if you knew exactly how much of this stuff was in here.
Okay, I'm Hans-Peter Black, Old Dominion University in Norfolk. Waste is a very interesting problem because it has to do with how we pay for it and how we handle it. And one of the things that I learned in the 1990s when I was very active in Germany for the Green Party to develop a waste avoidance concept was that we really have to think about how we handle this and how we put it back into the environment. And one of the things that came out, for example, in Germany is that if I had a house, if I go to the dump and bring mixed garbage, let's say wood and stones and other things that come from a building, I cannot afford it anymore in Germany. It's too expensive. I have to bring the wood separate from the stones and from everything else. So demolishing a building is no longer an option. You have to deconstruct it. So that's one of the things that I think we need to worry about. Why is it systemically possible in the United States to demolish a building and not reconstruct or deconstruct it? That's one point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to make is I'm very worried about a waste we are not talking about today that's coming in the future. The Zillow, the real estate company, did an estimate using a moderate sea level rise scenario that by 2155 cities will be gone. The residential areas will all be underwater. And that means all the buildings we are building there in the way we build them today will be waste. Waste in the ocean, waste somewhere else. If we would build the buildings in a way that they could be moved very easily, let's say, for example, with the concept for each room is an entity and we just take the room and build them somewhere else where they are much better. We would be prepared for the future where we have to move what is in the coastal zone. But we are not doing this. I'm talking to a few engineering companies that are open for this idea that maybe we need to think about what is the future of the city. The future of the city needs to be movable. But unfortunately, we have a normalcy bias. The normalcy bias is for 6,000 years, sea level didn't really change a lot. So why should it change in the next 100 years? And we need to understand that we are changing the system in a way that the future is different from the past. And that's the building industry is one of the core elements where I think we need to think about how can we build a city so that it's adapted to or can adapt to future changes in the environment. And one is with 90% of the population living in the coastal areas now and more moving in there, that's really where we are creating a waste for future generations that nobody will be able to handle if we continue to build the buildings in the way we are building them today. So prefabricating blocks of rooms, for example, and then moving them and putting them together should be easy for an engineer to solve, but we are not doing it.
Well, and I think part of the problem there is that we have to probably lose a city before we'll get serious about some of that. I mean, sadly, that's part of the problem.
It's called human nature. As most of you know, a number of years ago, I said that we could reduce the number of trucks in this country by 50% if we stop shipping air. Doug mentioned warehouses. This is a group of software engineers. 75, and you see everywhere since e-commerce took off, warehouses being built. Do you know what the purpose of the warehouse is? Besides Amazon. A warehouse is an excuse for bad information. You don't manage your supply chain with the right velocity to be able to move the products. Warehouses are capital at rest. And we need the velocity of capital. So 75% of the warehouses are waste. They're waste because it's inventory that someone didn't plan properly and understand because their information wasn't good, their technology wasn't good, and they hold products. They're holding money. We don't need 75% of the warehouses we have in this country. We don't need 50% of the trucks. Get the information right and stop moving air. Last time you opened an Amazon box, how many air pouches were there in it?
On the other hand, to play devil's advocate,
Ken?
with the Fukushima disaster, we discovered that we had an issue because the supply chains had gotten so tight, it just rippled through the system. So maybe a warehouse can also be a part of a stock and flow system where it's a little bit of a buffer against unplanned, as opposed to 100%. And I think in my industry, one of the things I see is that with respect to cities, and because we're big into cities, we've moved away from the word sustainability. We've adopted the word resilience, but unfortunately, it's as if the word resilience now has become, how can I plug engineering systems and solutions into this so that I can maintain this against all forces of nature, as opposed to actually coming to grips with what resilience actually means, which is you maintain your identity while changing into other systems or other environmental factors. Other questions, thoughts on any of this?
A quick comment. I actually live in Europe, so I wanted to say that what is being said about the situation in Germany is actually true all over Europe, and not only in construction. I think the regulation is changing in Europe in a way that when you buy something, whether you buy a house or a laptop or fruit, you're paying for its full life cycle rather than paying only for the product that you buy. And it's being done through something we don't like, which is called taxes. And interestingly enough, this is being very talked about and contested in Europe these days, because there is a perception that in doing so, Europe is less competitive with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is not necessarily doing the same thing. So talking about systemic, I think that we also need probably worldwide solutions in terms of how are we dealing with these things regulation-wise, financially, and so forth, because otherwise what is going to come into play is some sort of competition, like, well, it's cheaper to get rid of your waste in this part of the world than in another part of the world. And so regulation was much of a talk in the water debate and maybe less in the waste debate, but I think that regulation is a very, very important point here. Another thing I was thinking when Doc was when you were talking about Spain, and when that part of the conversation, there is countries in the world where there is very little waste because everything is being reused. I don't know who has ever been to sub-Saharan Africa. I've been a couple of times. Apart from plastic bags lining up the roads, which is just horrible and ugly, there is everything is being reused. That's the reason, and maintained, and that's the reason why you still find 1960s or 1970s old French taxis, which have probably driven 3 million miles or something like that, still driving around and being used as taxi blues. A broken phone will just be, the parts will be reused. Everything is reused, because there is such a lack of resources and money being one of the resources. So maybe there is an opportunity for reverse innovation, as I think we call it, for the things that are being done in the developing world, how they could come back to us and become better practices for what we do.
I want to come back to the comment that Hans-Peter made earlier about, why is it possible in Germany to deconstruct versus throw away in the United States? We know what the reasons are, right? It's because we have an organic system and you have a regulated system. Let's underscore the irony of an organic system where we throw everything away. So the question for us is, given our social, cultural, political environment in the United States, is it possible to achieve the same goals? I think it is. We have examples. The automotive industry in the United States, does anyone want to hazard a guess what percentage of every vehicle goes back into the supply stream? It's between 90 and 95%. That was done without imposition of outside forces. It's done in a system where the product is as far away from the original supplier as could possibly be. It's in the hands of the consumer. But that industry has somehow managed to very efficiently figure out how to get that material back. And one of the dilemmas with the increased automation, our cars are basically computers now with people and engines attached to them, creates a problem for recycling because those electronic components are not easily recycled in the traditional recycling stream. But from a manufacturing point of view, those components are made more and more modular so they can be yanked out and also recycled. So I'm hopeful that in spite of the fact that we can't, through our social and political institutions, implement the kinds of reclamation practices that are more common in Europe, that we can still manage to do that in the limits of our so-called free market system. And for me, it comes down to having information. If you know what the content of the building is, you have a much better chance at being able to reclaim rather than recycle. I think we're actually, I don't know how we managed to do this, but we're on schedule.
We are, but lunch isn't.
Oh, lunch isn't?
Actually, it's
Great.
It's going to be here in just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
And Brad reminded me that we actually have a sponsor, which is BEF.org, which is who COFES and Scion actually get their carbon offset credits from, and they're the ones that have provided lunch very graciously to all of us. I stepped out of the room to discover lunch, so I might be a little bit out of context. I'm going to carry this on just a little bit more. But I believe in Europe there's an end of life of vehicles initiative, where they had to accomplish by a certain point in time the ability to recycle all of the parts of these vehicles. We need an end of life for buildings kind of initiative. I would also say that I don't think it's making Europeans less competitive, but much more competitive and much more prepared for the future that we're into. And what I find in my industry is that the architects that are onto this and get it, they're either from Europe or they're from India.
Yeah. The chart you sent me? Well, you sent me 4 times, and I might have missed one. But on what topic? If I missed it, I apologize. I will look for it. Somebody
So you look for that, Mark?
make music while I'm
Yeah,
doing
no, I
it.
was just going to make a comment. So much of this has to do with the threshold of pain. And things don't change unless people are feeling sufficient pain. You made the comment just right now about India and China, and that's further evidence because they're feeling more pain than the rest of the world. We're talking about we should do this, we should do that, we should do that, and we won't, simply. We should. That would be the right thing to do. Even in this book that Brad was passing around, there's a lot of assumptions about perfect systems and people and agents behaving perfectly, but no one does that. So, you know, that's why I know this is a very pessimistic comment about people. And there was another book that I had read a while ago. It was a book on psychology that in somewhere in the recesses of our brain, our prehistoric brain, we get positive feedback on habits, that we do things that we recognize and that continuously gives us positive feedback. So we are, by our chemistry, simply reluctant to make change. And when change happens, the economics make sense, et cetera. There was also I've done a lot of work in my career in finite element analysis, simulation. There's an ASSESS initiative where why aren't we doing more simulation? And the cold hard truth is that no one ever gets credit for problems they prevent. But heroes are made when the problem is facing us and somehow they tend to solve it. So the real problem is that. It's up here.
Doc, do you still have the Undoing Project book near you? The Undoing Project. Somebody got the book. I think we're all getting a copy, aren't we? As attendees? That book speaks to the issues you're talking about. Just hold it up, Jack. About human behavior and the fact that, why we don't make decisions rationally. I'm sorry, Rajesh, go ahead.
So I agree with you that, same thing happens when, unless there is a pain, and then only we realize or we are forced to change. I mean, one good monsoon in India, and then we forget that there was ever water shortage, and that's the classic problem. Second thing is about habituation. So even if we know the problem, I think the way so it has to be, we have to create an habituation to fix it. So earlier I feel that the way it was done was by religion. Like for example, if you look in Islam, the way they wash their hands is clearly, seems like, when you have less water, that's how you would actually wash your hands. And since money has become a religion now, so that's the only way to habituate people, by attaching cost with these things. So yeah.
Jack has a few comments over here to address that slide.
Thanks. The bottom row left says right now we're wasting about 3 billion kid hours of learning per year because they simply do not have the opportunity to learn things. Or else we put them through, in the United States at least, a public school system that prevents them from learning things. So until we fix that, we're not going to have the kinds of people that can deal with the problems that we've been talking about for the last 2 hours. And we've been talking about for 7 years and not making any progress. Because among us, we're not smart enough yet to deal with this. Until we go down there and get those kids that are capable of understanding systems thinking, systems making, etc., and get them rolling, then maybe a decade from now, we'll begin to deal with our problems.
Yeah, but there's a reason.
Pardon me.
Microphone, Mark. Mark. For the record.
It gets right back to the point that I was making. Our education system, particularly the one I live in New York, and evolved due to the masses of immigrants that came to the United States, and they were looking to prepare a resource to work in offices as secretaries and work in factories and give those particular skill sets. And it hasn't fundamentally changed in recognition of how the world has changed. We're seeing this theme whether we're talking about waste, water, economics, education. It's fundamentally the same issue.
So the primary...
I'm not saying it shouldn't. I agree 100% with you. But something far more pervasive has to change.
The primary objective then that we really ought to look at under the topic waste is we've got to stop wasting the learning hours of these kids, because it's not us old folks that are going to solve this problem.
Jack, this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart. I've got, my kids are 6 and are 9 and my twins are 6. And the question that I always ask them every day is, what questions did you ask? Because it's not going to be about rote memorization in the future. We're going to have information at our fingertips. So it's going to be about being able to ask the right question and then be able to understand the context of what the answer comes back to you as. And so from my perspective, as we talk about changing something that seems very difficult to change in the short term, working at a very local level of asking my kids, what questions did you ask today?
Yeah.
What did you learn? And how do you, in context, understand those questions?
And today we're demonstrating that these kids, in a matter of 3 or 4 years, become astounding at fixing the problems that we're all ruminating about today.
To that
And in the
po-
middle band, with 10 more seconds, in the middle band is right down to COFES. That's a separate topic that says, until we learn to build software that doesn't have bugs in it, we're wasting $1 trillion a year worldwide of people fumbling around trying to figure out why things don't work or reworking a whole bunch of stuff. And it's just extremely important that we get after this notion of software integrity and figure out how to make bug-free software. And this requires about 100,000 people, I estimate, that are capable of doing that to clean up this trash that 5 million programmers a year are now doing.
So to that point, I am an educator, and I am a huge advocate of the fact that there is a lot of wasted time. Most kids are in school 180 days a year for 7 or 8 hours. Actually, in California at least, you're only required to go 175 days for 3 hours a day if you're homeschooling, 3 hours a day. But the issue is teaching kids about long-term thinking. So back to your point, as a musician, I understand that if you're going to have something at the end that's valuable, it takes time, it takes discipline. You know, a kid doesn't want to wait to watch the chicken make the egg. He just wants to go to the store and get the egg because he's hungry. She doesn't understand the value of time. So while they are wasting time, they don't know the value in waiting and working and discipline. And I think part of the issue is that with the internet, you know, a 7-year-old can see a t-shirt and buy it right away, and we have this whole fast fashion industry where they're making cheaper clothes that are actually a huge part of the waste problem, right? Because we want to look trendy, but there's no value. In 20 years, my shirt is not going to last for anything. We ship it off to Haiti where there's mounds and mounds and mounds of clothes there already and nobody's actually wearing them. So how do we teach kids to understand that there's more value in actually being a part of something, having a personal connection, and get off the internet, get off of this whole touchscreen idea, and go and do it themselves? How do we implement that process? Because by the time they're old enough to build buildings or create software or all these things, they're thinking in a sense of, this is my personal contribution. This is what I have to give. And I'm going to work till the end because that's what makes it valuable. Not that it's here immediately now. It's that I've been here through the whole process. And I think that's what millennials and the younger generation just don't have a handle on.
Okay.
Interestingly,
here?
for
Chris? One last comment. Okay, go ahead.
interestingly, for every trend, there is a counter trend. And I mean, my children also got educated that everything can be downloaded. And they're too young to have their first car, but they probably think they can just download it and probably for free. But there is some interesting trends. You can Google for them. There's one trend which is owning less, and there is a number of people that they own less than 100 things. 100 things is very, very little. There's
In
another
the first world.
I'm sorry?
In the first world.
In the first world, yes. And there is another interesting trend, which is to make and to own clothing which lasts a lifetime. There's a couple of companies in Europe, one I know in the UK, but I lost its name, but I could find it again. And they make T-shirts that are guaranteed 30 years.
I know people who are already doing that.
And so it's also interesting to see that, and these are just, these are maybe marginal societal movements, but still, for every trend there is a counter trend. For every movement we see, there is a counter movement, and there is always hope in those things.
Lunch.
We call that yin and yang.